The night air was thick with tension, the kind that made the world feel quieter than it should. A rusted old truck rattled down an empty road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Inside, two men sat in tense silence, their clothes stained with dirt and sweat, their eyes constantly darting to their rearview mirror. They had done it. They had broken free. After years behind bars, they were finally out. But freedom wasn't as simple as they had imagined. The cops would be hunting them by now, roadblocks being set up, faces plastered all over the news. They needed time to disappear, to find a way out of this mess. And they needed leverage. That's when they saw her. She was alone, locking up a small roadside diner, her short brown hair barely visible under the flickering neon sign. The place was deserted, the streets quiet. She looked like an easy target. Just a woman heading home after a long shift, unaware that two desperate men were watching her every move. They exchanged a glance. This was it. If they had a hostage, someone to use as a shield if things went south, maybe they'd have a better chance of slipping away unnoticed. It happened fast. Too fast for anyone to see. The woman turned toward her car, keys in hand, and before she could react, rough hands grabbed her from behind. A cloth bag was shoved over her head as she was dragged into the truck, her body shoved between the two men in the front seat. She didn't fight, didn't scream, just sat there, still and silent. The truck roared back to life, speeding away into the night. The men laughed, a nervous kind of laughter, as the adrenaline pumped through their veins. One of them, the one with a deep scar running down his cheek, looked back at their prisoner. "Looks like we just found ourselves a little insurance," he muttered. His partner grinned, tightening his grip on the wheel. "Yeah," he said, "lucky us." But the woman wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying or begging for her life. She just sat there, listening, her breathing controlled, measured. Something about her silence made the air inside the truck feel heavier, like a storm was brewing, unseen but inevitable. The scarred man frowned. "Ain't you gonna say anything?" he asked, nudging her arm. No response, just that eerie, unsettling stillness. They drove for miles, taking back roads, avoiding the main highways. The plan was simple: find an abandoned spot, somewhere they could lay low and figure out their next move. But as the night dragged on, the tension inside the truck grew thicker. The woman hadn't spoken a word, hadn't made a single move. It was unsettling. Most hostages begged, pleaded, cried, but not her. Finally, the driver exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his voice. "All right, lady, enough with this silent treatment. What's your deal?" Slowly, she turned her head toward him, though the bag still covered her face. Then, in a calm, almost amused voice, she finally spoke. "You made a mistake." The words hung in the air like a warning, sending a cold chill down both men's spines. The scarred man narrowed his eyes. "Yeah," he scoffed. "And why's that?" The woman tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at her lips beneath the fabric. "Because I'm not just some woman," she said. "I'm a Navy SEAL." Silence. The kind that made your stomach drop. The kind that made you question every decision that led you to this moment. The driver tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. The scarred man let out a short, nervous laugh, but it lacked the confidence it had before. "Yeah, right," he muttered. "Nice try." But deep down, doubt was already creeping in. The way she sat, the way she breathed, it all felt wrong. She wasn't scared. She wasn't panicking. She was waiting. The truck continued down the road, but the energy inside had shifted. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing. Was she bluffing? Or had they really just kidnapped the worst possible person? Then, before they could process the thought, everything changed. The woman moved, fast, too fast. Before the scarred man could react, she drove her elbow into his ribs with brutal force, knocking the wind out of him. At the same time, she kicked her legs up, slamming them against the dashboard, sending the truck swerving wildly across the road. The driver cursed, fighting to regain control, but she wasn't done. In a blur of motion, she yanked the bag off her head, revealing sharp, focused eyes that burned with something deadly. The scarred man lunged at her, but she was faster. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it with practiced precision, forcing him to cry out in pain. The truck jerked violently as the driver lost focus, and suddenly the world flipped upside down. The sound of metal screeching, tires skidding, glass shattering, it all blurred together as the truck spun out of control. That a deafening crash. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Smoke curled from the wreckage, the broken truck lying on its side in a ditch. Inside, groans of pain echoed as the two men struggled to pull themselves together, disoriented and battered. And then they heard it. The sound of boots crunching against gravel. Slow, deliberate. The woman was already out, standing tall, her silhouette barely visible against the dim glow of the moon. Blood trickled down her forehead from a small cut, but she barely seemed to notice. She rolled her shoulders, flexing her fingers, her gaze locked onto the men like a predator sizing up its prey. The driver coughed, dragging himself out of the wreckage, his heart pounding. What the hell are you?" he gasped, his voice hoarse. She took a step forward, her expression unreadable. "You should have picked someone else," she said, her voice calm, almost pitying. The scarred man scrambled backward, his mind racing. They had thought they were in control. They had thought they were the hunters. But now, staring into the eyes of the woman they had kidnapped, they realized the truth. They weren't the ones hunting anymore. They were the prey. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of dust and gasoline as the two men struggled to their feet. Their bodies ached from the crash, muscles screaming in protest, but fear kept them moving. They had been so sure of themselves, so confident that they had the upper hand. Now, standing in the wreckage of their escape, they were starting to realize just how wrong they had been. The woman took another step forward, her boots crunching against the gravel. The driver wiped the blood from his forehead, his hands trembling slightly. "Listen," he started, his voice uneven. "We didn't mean no harm, all right. We just needed a way out of town, that's all." She didn't respond. She just watched them, calm and composed, as if she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever excuse they were about to throw at her. The scarred man shifted uncomfortably, his breathing heavy. He had been in plenty of fights before, had spent most of his life surrounded by violence. But this was different. He wasn't looking at a scared hostage or some ordinary woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was looking at something else entirely. The truck engine sputtered, sending a weak trail of smoke into the night sky. The road was deserted, nothing but endless trees and shadows stretching into the distance. No witnesses, no help coming. The realization settled in, weighing down on them like a stone in their chests. The woman rolled her shoulders, tilting her head slightly. "You're running," she said finally, her voice steady. "That means you don't have a plan." The driver swallowed hard. You're desperate." She cut him off, taking another step. Desperation makes people sloppy. The scarred man clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're way out of line." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, like she was almost amused by the situation. "Am I?" The driver shot his partner a look, silently telling him to stand down. They had to be smart. They had no weapons, no backup, and no clue what this woman was capable of. She took her time watching them, studying their movements the way a predator studies its prey. Then she spoke again, her voice low and deliberate. "Do you even know who I am?" The driver hesitated. That was the problem. He didn't. She hadn't reacted the way she was supposed to. She hadn't begged or screamed or fought like some scared civilian. She had waited, calculated, and then, when the moment was right, she had made her move. The scarred man exhaled sharply, trying to regain some sense of control. "I don't care who you are," he muttered. "You're just some—" "Navy SEAL," she interrupted, her gaze locked onto his. The words hit harder this time. He had brushed them off before, but now, after everything that had happened, they rang in his ears like a warning bell. He had heard stories about SEALs before, the kind of training they went through, the things they could do. The driver forced a laugh, though it came out weaker than he intended. "Yeah? You expect us to believe that?" She didn't say anything. She just took another step forward, and for some reason, both men instinctively stepped back. The scarred man shook his head, trying to push away the growing unease. "Even if it's true, so what? You're outnumbered. You're alone. And we're not just gonna let you walk away." A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned slightly, looking toward the trees that lined the road. The movement was small, subtle, but enough to set them on edge. The driver followed her gaze, his pulse quickening. "What?" he asked. "What are you looking at?" She didn't answer right away. Then, after a pause, she spoke softly. "You think I'm alone?" The word sent a cold chill down his spine. The scarred man turned sharply, scanning the darkness, his heart pounding against his ribs. The trees stood still, the night eerily quiet, but suddenly the emptiness didn't feel so empty anymore. The driver forced himself to stay calm, clenching his jaw. "She's bluffing," he muttered. But was she? The woman exhaled slowly, as if she could hear the doubts creeping into their minds. Then she reached up and wiped the blood from her forehead, her fingers coming away stained red. "You wanted a hostage," she said, her tone almost casual. "Big mistake." The scarred man felt the weight of those words settle into his chest like a lead brick. He had spent years surviving off instincts, reading people, knowing when to fight and when to run. And right now, every part of him was screaming the same thing. "Run." The driver must have felt it too, because his hand hovered near his side, like he was reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He licked his lips, glancing at the wrecked truck. The engine was dead, smoke curling from the hood. There was no quick getaway. The woman took one last step forward, close enough now that they could see the sharp focus in her eyes, the quiet control in her posture. She wasn't worried. She wasn't scared. She was waiting. The driver's breath hitched. "What do you want from us?" She tilted her head slightly. "What do I want?" She let the question hang in the air before giving a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "That depends on what you do next." The scarred man's hands trembled. He had never felt this before, not just fear, but something worse. The realization that he had no control, that they had never been in control. They had made a terrible mistake. And now they were about to find out just how much worse things could get. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The scarred man wiped his palms against his pants, his mouth dry. He had been in some bad situations before, but nothing like this. Nothing where the person he thought was the victim suddenly became the one in control. The driver took a shaky step back, but he caught himself before it became too obvious. He wasn't about to show weakness, not when everything was already spiraling out of control. "All right," he muttered, forcing himself to sound steady. "Let's be smart about this." The woman didn't move, didn't even blink. It was like she was waiting for something. Or someone. The driver stole another glance at the tree line, unease creeping into his bones. "You got back up." His voice was quiet, like he wasn't sure if he wanted the answer. The woman remained unreadable, her expression giving nothing away. "You should be asking yourself why I haven't run." The scarred man swallowed hard. She was right. If she really thought she was in danger, she would have tried to escape by now. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had faced them without fear. The driver exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "We didn't plan for this," he admitted. The woman studied him, her gaze sharp. "That much is obvious." The scarred man shifted uneasily. "We didn't hurt you," he pointed out, as if that somehow made things better. "We did." "You took me," she cut in, her voice calm but firm. "That's enough." The driver felt his stomach twist. He had a sinking feeling that whatever happened next, they weren't the ones calling the shots anymore. Then in the distance, the snap of a twig echoed through the night. It was faint, barely noticeable, but enough to make both men tense. The scarred man spun toward the sound, his breath hitching. "Who's there?" The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, watching, as if she already knew what was coming. Another sound, a rustle in the trees. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. The driver's pulse thundered in his ears. "We need to get out of here," he muttered. The scarred man didn't argue. Whatever was in those trees, whatever had been waiting for them, they didn't want to find out. But when they turned back to the woman, she was already moving. Not running, not panicked. Just stepping forward, steady and unshaken, like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The driver clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "Who the hell are you?" The woman stopped just inches away, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes. "The last person you should have messed with." Another sound came from the trees, closer this time. Too close. The scarred man grabbed the driver's arm. "We're out of time." The woman exhaled slowly. Then for the first time she smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a reassuring one. It was something else. Something that sent a chill racing down their spines. "You were out of time the moment you took me," she said. The driver's gut twisted. He wanted to believe she was bluffing, wanted to convince himself that this was still a situation they could control. But deep down, he knew the truth. They had just walked into a nightmare they weren't getting out of. The driver's breath was uneven now, his mind racing. The night, once just an open road and a broken-down truck, now felt like it was closing in on them. The rustling in the trees had stopped, but that somehow made it worse. The silence was heavy, pressing against them like an unseen force. The scared man's hand twitched at his side. He didn't have a weapon, at least, not one that would make a difference. If she really was a Navy SEAL, she could take them both down before they even had a chance to react. And whoever was out there, hiding in the darkness, was likely waiting for the right moment to strike. The woman tilted her head slightly, watching them with an almost unsettling patience. "You feel that?" she asked softly. The driver swallowed. "Feel what?" She took another step closer, her presence alone making both men tense. "That feeling in your gut," she said. "The one telling you to run." The scarred man inhaled sharply. Enough of this. His voice was strained, like he was trying to convince himself that they still had a choice. "You don't get to stand there and act like you're in control." She raised an eyebrow. "Am I not?" The driver clenched his jaw. He could feel it, the shift. When they had taken her, they had thought she was the weak link. Just a woman, just a way to buy themselves some time. But now, standing in front of her, he knew they had been wrong. painfully, disastrously wrong. A crack in the darkness made both men whip around, their backs stiff with fear. It was a small noise, barely there, but now every sound felt amplified, every shadow a threat. The scarred man exhaled slowly. "We don't even know who's out there," he muttered. The woman crossed her arms. "I do." That sent a fresh wave of unease through them. The driver's hands were damp with sweat. "You set this up," he accused. "This was never about us kidnapping you." She smiled slightly. "No," she admitted. "It wasn't." The scarred man took a slow step backward, his breath coming faster. "You let us take you." Her silence was answer enough. The realization hit them like a freight train. They weren't the hunters here. They were the prey. The driver's legs twitched, every instinct screaming at him to run. "We need to go. Now." The scarred man wasn't listening. His gaze darted between the woman and the trees, his mind desperate for a way out. "You planned this," he repeated, almost as if he needed to hear it again to believe it. "You let us think we had the upper hand." She didn't deny it. Another sound came from the woods, closer this time. The driver gritted his teeth. "I don't care who she is," he whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here before." A voice cut through the night, stopping him cold. Too late. It wasn't hers. The driver's heart nearly stopped. His eyes darted to the trees, and for the first time he saw them. Shadows moving. Shapes stepping into the dim glow of the broken truck's headlights. Not just one. Not just two. More. A sinking dread pooled in his stomach as the figures closed in, silent, deliberate, with a kind of precision that only came from training. The woman hadn't been bluffing. She hadn't been alone. And now there was nowhere left to run. The driver's pulse pounded in his ears as the figures emerged from the darkness, their movements controlled, practiced. He didn't need to see their faces to know they were trained professionals. This wasn't just some rescue team. These were her people. The scared man's breath came in sharp bursts, his body rigid. He glanced at the woman, who remained calm, her posture unreadable. "This was a setup," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "You wanted this to happen." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes locked on the men who had taken her. "You made it easy," she finally said, her voice measured. "I needed to find you, and you handed yourselves over." The driver's stomach twisted. "Find us?" He could barely get the words out. "Why?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "Because you weren't just two guys who broke out of prison." The scarred man stiffened, his entire body on edge. "We." She cut him off. "You were supposed to disappear. You weren't meant to be found." The driver's breath hitched. "How do you know that?" The figures surrounding them stopped just short of the clearing, but they were close enough now that the driver could see flashes of gear, the faint glint of weapons strapped to their bodies. Whoever they weren't amateurs. The woman took another step, and for the first time, the driver saw something new in her expression. Not just confidence, not just control. A quiet, burning certainty. "Because I was sent to find out why." The words hit like a hammer. The scarred man's hands curled into fists, his entire frame trembling with frustration. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's not." The woman took another step closer, and now her voice carried something sharper, a cutting edge. "You didn't escape." The driver's breathing went shallow. The scarred man swallowed hard. "That's not true." She studied him, as if deciding how much more she was willing to say. Then she delivered the final blow. "You were let go." The driver's knees nearly buckled. "No," he whispered. "That doesn't make sense." The woman's gaze didn't waver. doesn't it?" The scared man's face twisted with something between rage and fear. "That's a lie." The woman's silence was more unsettling than any argument she could have given. The driver felt his world tilting. None of this was supposed to happen. They had broken out. They had run. That was supposed to be the end of it. But now, standing here, trapped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who knew more than they should, he realized the truth. They hadn't been running. They had been walking straight into something far worse. The driver's breath came in short gasps, his mind racing to make sense of it all. The idea that they had been let go, not escaped, was something he couldn't process. It changed everything. It meant they were never in control, not even for a second. His eyes darted to the scarred man, searching for some kind of reassurance, but all he saw was raw panic. The woman took one last step forward, close enough now that they could see the quiet intensity in her expression. "Someone wanted you out," she said, her voice unwavering. "And they wanted to see where you'd go." The scarred man shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "That doesn't make sense," he growled. "Who would do that?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small device no bigger than a key fob. With one press of a button, a low beep echoed through the trees. A signal. The driver's stomach dropped. A sharp noise split through the air, a mechanical hum, low but growing louder. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath their feet. Then through the gaps in the trees, they saw it. A helicopter, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky, descending fast. The scared man's fists tightened. "No," he said under his breath. "No, no, no." The woman's expression remained unreadable. "They were watching you from the start." The driver stumbled back, his pulse hammering. "Who?" His voice cracked. "Who was watching us?" The woman let the question hang for a moment before she finally spoke. "The same people who put you in that prison." The scarred man let out a bitter laugh, his body shaking with adrenaline. "We were framed," he muttered, his voice almost disbelieving. "All this time, we thought we escaped, but we were just part of something bigger." The helicopter hovered overhead now, the wind from the blades kicking up dirt and leaves. The figures in the shadows remained still, waiting. The driver's chest tightened. What happens now? The woman glanced up at the chopper, then back at them. "That depends," she said carefully. "Are you ready to stop running?" The scarred man exhaled, his hands flexing at his sides. "And if we say no?" The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Then you keep running. But this time, you'll know there's nowhere left to hide." The words sank deep, heavy with finality. For the first time, the driver realized the truth. This had never been about escape. It had always been about what came next. And now, standing on the edge of the unknown, he understood. They were never meant to get away. They were meant to choose. The driver stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking deep into his chest. The sound of the helicopter overhead was deafening, yet all he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding like a warning. The woman's words hung between them, waiting for an answer. This was it, the moment where they had to decide. Run and stay trapped in a cycle they never understood, or face whatever truth had been chasing them from the start. The scarred man clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. His entire life had been about survival. Moving forward, never looking back. But now, for the first time, he hesitated. The driver could see it, the flicker of doubt, the weight of too many questions left unanswered. The woman watched them carefully, her posture steady, as if she already knew what they were going to do. "You don't have much time," she said, her voice barely rising over the roar of the blades above. The driver turned to the scarred man, desperation creeping into his expression. "We can't run forever," he said. "If we don't stop now, they'll just keep coming." The scarred man let out a slow, measured breath. "And if we go with them?" The woman didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch before finally saying, "Then you get to know the truth." The driver's stomach twisted. The truth. That was what scared him the most. He had spent so long trying to stay ahead of whatever had put them in that prison, but now he realized that he had never really wanted to know why. Because knowing meant facing everything he had tried to outrun. The helicopter's landing gear touched the ground, and the figures that had been hidden in the shadows began moving. Not aggressively, not like a threat, just waiting, watching. The scarred man exhaled sharply, then nodded. "I'm done running." The driver hesitated a moment longer, but deep down, he had already made his choice. With a final glance at the endless trees surrounding them, he nodded too. The woman didn't smile, didn't offer reassurance. She simply turned and walked toward the chopper, expecting them to follow. The wind from the blades whipped against their faces as they climbed inside. The driver's heart pounded, but there was no turning back now. The moment they sat down, the door slid shut, sealing them inside. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, the driver looked down at the clearing below. The truck, the trees, the place where their old lives had ended. It was disappearing beneath them, shrinking into the darkness. The scarred man stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The woman sat beside them, silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Whatever came next, it was out of their hands now. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't running anymore. The scarred man clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. His entire life had been about survival. Moving forward, never looking back. But now, for the first time, he hesitated. The driver could see it, the flicker of doubt, the weight of too many questions left unanswered. The woman watched them carefully, her posture steady, as if she already knew what they were going to do. "You don't have much time," she said, her voice barely rising over the roar of the blades above. The driver turned to the scarred man, desperation creeping into his expression. "We can't run forever," he said. "If we don't stop now, they'll just keep coming." The scarred man let out a slow, measured breath. "And if we go with them?" The woman didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch before finally saying, "Then you get to know the truth." The driver's stomach twisted. The truth. That was what scared him the most. He had spent so long trying to stay ahead of whatever had put them in that prison, but now he realized that he had never really wanted to know why. Because knowing meant facing everything he had tried to outrun. The helicopter's landing gear touched the ground, and the figures that had been hidden in the shadows began moving. Not aggressively, not like a threat, just waiting, watching. The scarred man exhaled sharply, then nodded. "I'm done running." The driver hesitated a moment longer, but deep down, he had already made his choice. With a final glance at the endless trees surrounding them, he nodded too. The woman didn't smile, didn't offer reassurance. She simply turned and walked toward the chopper, expecting them to follow. The wind from the blades whipped against their faces as they climbed inside. The driver's heart pounded, but there was no turning back now. The moment they sat down, the door slid shut, sealing them inside. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, the driver looked down at the clearing below. The truck, the trees, the place where their old lives had ended. It was disappearing beneath them, shrinking into the darkness. The scarred man stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The woman sat beside them, silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Whatever came next, it was out of their hands now. And for the first time in a long time, They weren't running anymore.